The wives of the Reich were figures who combined the appearance of elegance with the shadow of invisible power, a power that operated among official dinners, gala balls, and private meetings with the men who governed Nazi Germany. In the early light of day, they could be seen greeting with a studied smile, strolling through the gardens of official residences, or accompanying their husbands to propaganda events. But behind that appearance hid a close link to the machinery of terror that defined the Third Reich. Their daily life oscillated between the comfort of high society and the awareness, when not the active participation, in the brutality of the regime. The images of Eva Braun beside Adolf Hitler at Berghof, of Magda Goebbels supervising her children while her husband executed extermination plans, or of Leni Riefenstahl filming the glorification of Nazism, represent a disturbing contrast. Women immersed in a world of rituals and aesthetics, while violence and death marked the pulse of their immediate surroundings. What drove these women to support the most powerful and bloodthirsty men in history? The answer is not simple, but it begins at the junction between ambition, social conformity, fascination with power, and a historical context that shaped their decisions. Prepare yourselves then for this journey through history. We will thoroughly unravel the hidden side of Nazi power women. Interwar Germany was a country marked by humiliation after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The devastated economy, the loss of territories, and the imposed debt generated a climate of resentment that spread throughout society. Women, whose traditional role centered on home and family, also began to feel the effects of social and political transformation. In the cities, some gained access to education and work, while in rural areas, the pressure to maintain traditional values remained strong. The Nazi Party, in its rise to power, exploited this context. It offered a framework of security and a sense of belonging to those who felt disoriented by social instability. The NS Frauenschaft, the party's women's organization, promoted the idea that women should be mothers and pillars of the home, but also defenders of the Reich, transferring obedience and ideological control to the domestic sphere. Eva Braun was born in Munich in 1912 into a middle-class family that valued stability and discipline. From a young age, she showed an interest in photography and cinema, but also in the city's social life. Her education was conventional, with a strong component of rules and respect for authority, but her contact with cultural and youth circles allowed her to develop an independent spirit. Magda Goebbels, on the other hand, came from a more complex background. Daughter of a Belgian engineer and a German woman, her childhood was marked by turbulent family relationships and frequent changes of residence. From a very young age, Magda showed determination, ambition, and a dominant character, traits that would make her the ideal companion for Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. Gertrud Scholtz-Klink, leader of the National Socialist Women's League, and Leni Riefenstahl, film director and Hitler's photographer, had different trajectories, but they coincided in a fascination with Nazi leaders and the possibility of leaving a mark on history, whether through direct political power or cultural manipulation. Marriages and strategic alliances played a central role in the consolidation of these women within the regime. Eva Braun, despite her romantic relationship with Hitler, became a witness and silent support of his private life and of decisions that would affect millions. Magda Goebbels married Joseph Goebbels in 1929, creating a team that combined her husband's political intelligence with her capacity for organization and domestic control, influencing the upbringing of children within the precepts of Nazism. Gertrud Scholtz-Klink, married to a party official, took advantage of her position to rise within the female structure of the SS, while Leni Riefenstahl used her talent and closeness to Hitler to secure a privileged role in the propaganda and image of the regime. Each marriage or bond consolidated a circle of power, in which the woman exercised influence directly or indirectly, aware of the responsibility that implied. These women began to assume roles within Nazism long before the war broke out. They participated in propaganda events, led women's organizations, and, in some cases, administered human or material resources that had an impact on the state machinery. The NS Frauenschaft, for example, organized courses to train women in ideological education and supervision of child rearing according to party principles. Magda Goebbels led activities to instill in her children and other young people the obedience, nationalism, and anti-Semitism that would be pillars of their ideology. Eva Braun, although more relegated to a private role, had access to privileged information about the leaders and was part of Hitler's inner circle, receiving visits from high-ranking officers and participating in dinners where political strategies were discussed. Riefenstahl, for her part, worked on constructing the visual narrative of the regime, shaping public perception of Nazi power through documentaries and photographs that glorified the Führer and his followers. The contrast between family life and the brutality of the regime was a constant that defined the existence of these women. While they prepared banquets, supervised the education of children, or attended social events, concentration camps operated miles away, and the war consumed millions of lives. Some women were aware of the magnitude of the horror, but normalized it through ideological indoctrination and emotional distance. Magda Goebbels, for example, showed extreme affection for her children while supporting, without question, the extermination policy that her husband executed. Riefenstahl, for her part, claimed to be unaware of the details of the concentration camps, although she actively contributed to the propaganda that sustained the regime. Everyday life and the banality of evil intertwined, and these women learned to manage their position skillfully, mixing affection, aesthetics, and pragmatism. As Nazi power consolidated, the role of these women became more evident. The influence they exercised over their husbands, over public events, and over the education of their children reflected the importance of the female inner circle in the machinery of the Reich. Eva Braun, with her discreet presence, became a symbol of loyalty and companionship. Magda Goebbels, a model of obedience and family discipline. Scholtz-Klink, an example of female leadership within the party structure. And Riefenstahl, the creator of the visual narrative that reinforced the image of absolute power. Each one, from her sphere of action, contributed to the consolidation of Nazism and the maintenance of its apparent social normality, while violence and terror grew around them. Social assent and participation in propaganda marked critical moments that outlined their power. The women of the Reich quickly understood that appearance, obedience, and the ability to influence key men were tools that could consolidate their position. They attended conferences, supervised event logistics, coordinated the ideological training of other women, and ensured that the children of leaders were raised according to Nazi principles. Control of public image was not just an aesthetic exercise, but an instrument of political legitimation. Decisions about clothing, gestures, the education of children, and social relationships translated into consolidation of authority and access to privileged information. At this point, if you are following the story, subscribe to the channel to learn more about key figures of Nazism and the dark secrets behind their power. As the war progressed, these women found themselves more immersed in the heart of violence. Household management, childcare, and participation in public events coexisted with the indirect supervision of genocidal policies. Magda Goebbels, for example, became an active element in the morale of officers and in the education of her children as future bearers of Nazi ideology. Riefenstahl continued producing films that exalted strength, discipline, and obedience, consolidating the perception of an invincible Reich. Eva Braun shared Hitler's intimacy witnessing his daily routine, his strategic decisions, and his perspective on the war, becoming a confidant and privileged observer of absolute power. Scholtz-Klink supervised female training in the party, reinforcing norms and values that sustained the patriarchal hierarchy of the Reich. The first signs of direct involvement in the machinery of terror emerged in the handling of education and propaganda. The upbringing of children, control of information, and influence over husbands showed that these women were not mere accessories, but actors who actively contributed to the normalization of violence. The combination of ambition, discipline, and loyalty to the party generated a circle where obedience and complicity became invisible norms. Their ability to adapt to power, to shape public perception, and to exercise silent influence defined a unique role, which was rarely recognized outside the circles close to the Reich. Their social ascent not only reflected personal ambition, but was intrinsically linked to the expansion of Nazi power and control of the family and public environment. Each participation in propaganda, each social event, each decision about the education of children consolidated their role as women of power, while the brutality of the regime continued its advance. But now we're going to talk about how these women would move from indirect influence to more direct involvement in the management of terror and the Holocaust, leaving the viewer anticipating the dramatic outcomes and the inevitable fall of the Reich. The women of the Reich, who for years had exercised a silent but significant influence, reached their point of consolidation during the war years. Their participation in Nazi propaganda intensified, not only as decorative figures beside the leaders, but as active actors in the construction of the Third Reich's narrative. Magda Goebbels, for example, personally supervised activities of the Hitler Youth and Women's organizations, ensuring that the education of officers' children and the population aligned with party ideals. Her home became a microcosm of the Reich, where obedience, discipline, and ideology were imparted with the same force as taught in official institutions. Eva Braun, although more relegated to a private role, shared with Hitler her thoughts on government decisions and was a participant in the Führer's daily life, which placed her in a position of privileged observer of the machinery of power. Leni Riefenstahl continued filming and documenting propaganda events, including military acts, mass rallies, and armed forces training, shaping the perception of Nazism as an invincible and glorious regime. The role of these women also extended to control over the family and social environment. They supervised the education of children, the social interactions of power circles, and the public image of their husbands. Domestic management became a political act. Each meeting, each social event, each gesture of obedience reinforced the narrative of an orderly and morally superior Reich. The influence of these women was not limited to the private sphere. They participated in propaganda activities, from organizing events to selecting participants in films and official acts. The combination of charisma, discipline, and ability for social manipulation consolidated their role as figures of indirect, though decisive, power. As the war progressed and the regime's systematic violence intensified, the complicity of these women became more evident. They participated directly or indirectly in crimes, whether through managing the households of leaders who executed genocidal policies, educating their children in Nazi ideology, or providing logistical support to extermination programs. Magda Goebbels, in an act of extreme loyalty to the party and her husband, Joseph, carried out the deaths of her 6 children before committing suicide with him. The Berlin bunker, a decision that reflects the total internalization of ideology and blind obedience to the power structure they had served. Eva Braun died alongside Hitler, sealing her fate and demonstrating that proximity to absolute power implied fatal participation, though often indirect, in the massive destruction of human lives. Leni Riefenstahl although not directly involved in murders, contributed to the justification and glorification of the regime through her films, which reinforced obedience, military discipline, and the perception of racial superiority that legitimized state violence. The fall of the Reich in the final days of World War II was a moment of dramatic decisions for these women. Berlin was surrounded, Allied bombing razed the city, and the structure of Nazi power was crumbling. In the Führer's bunker, Magda Goebbels made the decision to take the lives of her children and then commit suicide with Joseph, an act that symbolizes the convergence of loyalty, desperation, and extreme indoctrination. Eva Braun, who had married Hitler a few hours before the suicide, chose to accompany him to the end, facing death in a gesture that combined love, fidelity, and acceptance of the fate imposed by the fall of the regime. Other women, like Scholtz-Klink, were arrested or managed to survive, facing shame, trial, and the disappearance of the influence they had built. The historical perception of these women is complex. Some survived and were judged for their participation or complicity, while others managed to remain anonymous or rebuild their lives in secret. Historiography has debated their degree of responsibility, from the view that considers them mere instruments of their husbands to interpretations that see them as active agents, aware of the violence they perpetuated and the effects of their actions. Their role challenges the traditional notion of culpability, showing how obedience, ideological manipulation, and personal ambition can combine to sustain a regime of terror. Analysis of their psychology reveals patterns of power, loyalty, fear, and fascination with authority, as well as a commitment to ideals that justified extreme violence. The women of the Reich also leave a legacy in terms of historical memory and understanding of female power in totalitarian regimes. Their influence demonstrates that the exercise of power does not always manifest through visible decisions or official positions. Sometimes it is exercised through family management, education, propaganda, and public image. The complexity of their guilt, obedience to authority, and internalization of Nazi ideology shows how structures of systematic violence require the active or passive participation of multiple actors, including those whose influence is perceived as secondary. Their story invites reflection on the mechanisms of manipulation, conformity, and complicity that allow the expansion of authoritarian and genocidal regimes. In sociological terms, the case of these women reveals how power can be negotiated, exercised, and consolidated in spaces traditionally considered feminine. Household management, children's education, participation in women's organizations, and public representation of the regime were not mere decorative functions. They were instruments of social and political control. Eva Braun, Magda Goebbels, Scholtz-Klink, and Riefenstahl used these tools to consolidate the position of their husbands and the Reich itself, showing that female collaboration in totalitarian power structures can be as crucial as direct action in the military or administrative field. The historical legacy also highlights the need to examine moral responsibility beyond direct physical action. Although many of these women didn't wield weapons or sign execution orders, their decisions and influence facilitated the implementation of genocidal policies. The ideological education of their children, the social legitimation of their husbands' power, and the propagation of Nazi aesthetics through culture and media constituted forms of participation in the machinery of terror. History presents them as figures who operated at the visible margins of power, but whose impact was central to the perpetuation of the regime and its crimes. As the Third Reich crumbled, confrontation with reality was inevitable. The final decisions of these women, from the collective suicide of the Goebbels to the disappearance of others into anonymity, reveal the intensity of ideological commitment and the inability to separate personal identity from the power structure they had served. The fall of the Reich exposed the fragility of the control mechanisms that had helped sustain and glorify violence, and the actions of these women show how obedience and complicity can become matters of life and death. What fact surprised you most? I'll read you in the comments. Subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can learn about these forgotten stories of Nazism.